Good morning. It is 10 o'clock a.m. Central Standard Time, March the 10th, 2021. Here in Seagoville, the weather it's cloudy, it's warm, and it's windy. And we want to welcome you to the STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. I want to say a very special welcome to Molina High School. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching teachers and you have not registered, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/EEC register and sign up. This is just for our attendance records. This morning, we're going to do a program called Carrying Capacity. During this virtual field trip, students will relate carrying capacity to population dynamics, calculate birth rates and exponential growth of populations, analyze and predict the effects of non-renewable resource depletion, and analyze and make predictions about the impact on populations of geographic locales due to diseases, birth and death rates, urbanization, and natural events. Ms. Nash will do carrying capacity. Ms. Ramirez will explain birth rates and growth. Mr. Monroe, non-renewable resource depletion, and the impacts on population will be conducted by Mrs. Fuller. You cannot verbally speak to us during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/EEC /question/answer if you have any questions. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Mrs. Nash is going to tell you all about carrying capacity.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. Today we're talking about carrying capacity, and it's an important issue for all of us, a concept that's important for us to understand because it directly affects life, all life on our planet. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about the concept and the things that affect the carrying capacity. So what do we mean by the term carrying capacity? It's the number of individuals of a particular species that the environment can carry or sustain. So in the background here, I've got that buffalo herd. So the North American prairie once sustained a population of millions upon millions of these gigantic herbivores. And they were migratory, they moved through the environment. They didn't stay in one place for very long. Okay. And that reduced their impact, it made the impact on the plant species, which was distributed through time. Okay. They fertilized one place and then they moved on. They ate there, they fertilized and moved on. They had lots of different connections to other animal species in that area. So there were millions of them. They were all almost completely wiped out by hunting. As part of the tactics in the war against the Indians to eliminate the buffalo, and also for hides and meat. Okay. But it's an example of what can happen when we get involved in a natural ecosystem. Okay. So different things can affect the carrying capacity. So if the climate changes, it might affect it positively or negatively, more probably. When we have technological advances, we can also increase the carrying capacity of particularly agricultural land and the behavior. So if we eat less meat, then we can have more plants. Okay. And things that decrease the carrying capacity, again, climate and environmental degradation. Okay, when we plowed up that prairie, okay, all those native grasses and native plants were gone. Okay, so that decreased the number of that population. Okay. They can become extinct. Okay, and we can introduce new competitors or more probably invasive species. Okay. So couple things to consider. The carrying capacity is how many organisms can a habitat or an ecosystem support, the water and the plants. Okay. And then the froggies, what do they need to support? For support, they need the water and they need the insects that eat the plants. Okay. So what we can think of as the carrying capacity, here's a little chart here. So we have the animal population. Let's just think about the deer, although same is true of the other animals. So we have a certain carrying capacity, and then in spring they breed and they have babies, lots of babies, and we have what we call a seasonal surplus. We have more animals being produced. And what happens to if we get too many? They may eat themselves out of house and home and starve. They get diseases. They have more accidents. Weather can affect them. Hunting and predation can also affect the numbers to bring it down. When we eliminate any of these factors over here, we can end up with a surplus with lots and lots of animals. Okay? And inevitably, other bad things will begin to happen until we get back down to our carrying capacity. So remember that curve there. So this is an example of one of those famous examples of fluctuations in populations, and the interaction between predator and prey populations is it's a 10-year cycle, and it's been occurring. They've got records. So see here where the records start 1855, and that's because both these animals, the hare and the lynx, were both hunted for fur, and the Hudson Bay Company kept meticulous records of how many furs were harvested in any one year. And they discovered that there was a 10-year cycle across the whole country, all of Canada, up into Alaska and the northern US that have these animals that occurred regularly. And the cycle is driven by food resources and predation. And they did really interesting studies, okay, to try to figure out what's happening. Turns out that hares, like rabbits, breed like rabbits, okay, and they can breed at age 1, okay, 1 year old, and they can have 3 or 4 lizards in a year, and the population can basically explode. When that happens, then the predators have a lot of food, and they can have lots of babies who also survive. And so the predator population goes up, and then they begin to bring down. They're what's really causing the snowshoe hare population to go down again. So lynx are kind of the most famous one, but also weasels, hawks, and owls all depend on that snowshoe hare. So a really interesting example of the connection between the predator and prey. So they all rely on each other. And one of the really great examples that we're going to talk about is our friend the wolf. So humans tend to eliminate that apex predator. That would be the bear, the wolf, the mountain lion, the wolverine. And when those animals are eliminated, the prey population, particularly deer, can overpopulate and end up destroying their habitat, getting sick and weak. So there's that connection. So one of the really great things to read about and investigate a little further is what happened in Yellowstone National Park when they brought back the wolf. When they brought back the wolf to that population, the elk, there were too many elk, and they were eating all the plants, and they were destroying the creek sides. Okay, they were overgrazing. So the wolves ate a lot of elk, but they also kept them moving. Okay, so they didn't congregate in one particular area. So the wolf stabilized the elk population. They were healthier, and then the trees began to come back along the creeks that the bears like to eat, the birds like to eat the berries, have places to nest. The beaver had food, they came back. They built dams and ponds, and fish came back, and frogs came back. And then all the things that the wolf kill also helped all these scavengers. An American eagle, okay, our national bird, actually eats a lot of already dead things. They're kind of a big scavenger. And of course, our friend the raven. So a really amazing connection of how the carrying capacity of that park was affected by too many elk. And so that there were lots of elk, but there weren't any of these other guys around. Okay? Once we brought back the wolf, then that land's carrying capacity increased in diversity. Right? What different kinds of animals was it supporting? Not as many elk, but more beaver, more eagles, more birds, more bears, all those other animals. So everything is connected in nature. So we have to respect the carrying capacity of our planet. Remember that we're not the only ones here, okay? And that we need to respect the diversity of our plant and animal cousins when we calculate how we use our natural resources. Okay. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can ask Dr. Gorman.
Yes, one question. What is the exact definition of the carrying capacity? Ms. Nash covered the whole thing, but the written definition is the carrying capacity of an environment is the maximum population size of a biological species that can be sustained by that specific environment, given the food, habitat, water, and other resources available. There you go. All right, now Ms. Ramirez is going to talk to you about birth rates and exponential growth.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about birth rates and growth factors. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and then we'll get started with our presentation. And it might take just a second for me to get that going. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the birth rate or natality. And as we go through the presentation, there's a couple of essential questions that I want you guys to keep in mind. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you guys will be able to answer these two questions. The first question is, what is crude birth rate and how can you calculate it? And the second question is, what is exponential growth rate and how does it look represented in a graph? So keep those two questions in mind as we go through the presentation today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that crude birth rate. And the crude birth rate is simply the number of live births per 1,000 individuals of a population per year. And it's super easy to calculate. So we take a look at our example here. If we have a population of 1,500 brown bears, and in 1 year, they had 17 births and 8 deaths, we can use that information to calculate a crude birth rate for that population. So the simple equation is simply the number of births divided by the time period, and then that answer divided by the total population size. And then to get your birth rate, you just multiply that answer by 1,000. So for example, using the data that we have in this diagram, the number of births we had was 17, and we know our time period is 1 year. So we can put 17 over 1, and then divide that by the population size, which we know is 1,500. And then we can multiply that by 1,000. If you put all that in the calculator, you'll get about 11.33 births per 1,000 individuals per year. So super easy equation for you guys to follow to find the crude birth rate. The next thing we're going to talk about is the growth rate itself. And the growth rate is also super simple. It's essentially the birth rate minus the death rate, and that gives you the growth rate. Now, the growth rate can be a positive growth rate, and it looks like this when represented in a chart. It can also be a negative growth rate represented in the second diagram, or it can be a zero growth rate, meaning that the population size is not changing. And so that's what this looks like in a chart as well. And then here's another way to chart that information. So this is with population growth rate. So you can compare the population growth rate of Kenya, the US, and Italy. If we take a look at Kenya, it's kind of heavy or bigger at the bottom and more narrow at the top. That represents a rapid growth rate. Take a look at the US in the middle, it's kind of the same level throughout, and that represents a slow growth rate. And then we take a look at Italy over here, who kind of has a zero growth or a decrease in growth rate. So you can see it's getting smaller toward the bottom. And scientists think that's probably why, unfortunately, Italy was hit pretty hard by the COVID pandemic, is because they have a high elderly population. And of course, we now know that that is who is really susceptible to COVID-19. And then, so that's growth rate. And our next thing we're going to take a look at is what we call a species biotic potential. And biotic potential is the fastest rate at which its population can grow. And there's two ways that we can separate populations. We can call them an R-selected species, and we can call them a K-selected species. So if you take a look at this diagram, what do you think might be some differences between the R species and the K species? And feel free to pause the video if you would like time for discussion. But these two species differ in the number of births per reproductive cycle, also in the age that the reproduction begins, and also in the lifespan of the organism. So let's take a look at the R species first. So the R-selected species, or the R strategist, they are adapted to living in fluctuating environments where there might be changing temperatures or changing food availability. And if you take a look at our diagram for the R species, we can tell that they are normally going to be your smaller species. They have shorter lifespans. They can produce many offspring, and they usually have little parental care after they give birth to their young. Now let's take a look at the K-selected species and how they differ. So the K-strategist, or the K species, they live in a fairly predictable environment. And as we can see from the pictures, they're usually going to be your larger species. They usually have a longer lifespan. They usually have fewer offspring, and they provide more parental care because they have fewer offspring. And their chances of surviving are usually controlled by density dependent factors. So they have, these two types of species have different reproductive factors. So the R species, their way is they're just going to produce as many young as they can to hopefully increase the rate of survival. The K-selected species is going to have few young, but they're really going to invest that time and energy into making sure that those few young are going to survive. So that's the difference between the R and the K species. The next thing we're going to take a look at is exponential growth. So in the previous segment, you learned about carrying capacity. In this segment, we're going to be looking at the exponential growth. And that is simply, if you take a look at the graph, you can take a moment to analyze the graph and what you think this graph is showing us regarding exponential growth. And so we know that exponential growth is an accelerating pattern of increased population growth. And if we take a look at the chart, it kind of makes a J shape. So the shape to represent exponential growth is kind of be like an upward curve, and it's J shaped. And it usually only occurs when populations have plenty of resources, when there's no competition or predators. However, we know that in the real life, it's usually not the case. So there's usually going to be some sort of limiting factor that's eventually going to stop that exponential growth. But a good example of exponential growth would be like bacteria. They can just reproduce super rapidly, especially even in a little petri dish. So that's exponential growth. And we're going to take a look at exponential growth and how to calculate the exponential growth for this particular rabbit population that we have here in this graph. So here's our exponential growth formula. So take a moment to kind of understand what those letters mean and how we're going to use it. And we're going to try and calculate the exponential growth of this rabbit population that we just saw in that previous slide. And it's also down here in the bottom again. So the capital P is the total population after a set time. P sub 0 is just your starting population. And if we take a look at our graph, if we look at year 0, we know that our starting population for this example is 50 rabbits. And then E is known as Euler's number. It's a constant. And then R, the superscript R, is the percent rate of growth, and that's R unknown in this example. So that's what we're trying to find out in this example. And then T is simply the time. So if we take a look at our example here, here is our equation again, and I simply just plugged in my numbers using the graph data that we have. So in this case, I just chose to use the data for year number 2, but you could use data from any year and you should get the same answer. So here I chose year number 2. So for my capital P, the total population after time T, since I chose year 2, I'm going to take a look at our diagram over here, and I circled it. For year 2, the total population was 128. So I plugged in 128 for my capital P. I did 128 equals the P sub 0. So my starting population, if I look on the graph for year 0, we know that it's 50. So I plugged in that number 50. I just copied down that Euler's number E, and then we're looking for R. So I don't know R, so that stays the same. But my time period, since I looked at year 2, I'm going to put the number 2 there. So now all you have to do is just solve it like you would any old equation. I divided each side by 50. So 128 divided by 50, plug it in the calculator, I get 2.56 equals E raised to the R times 2. So I just, to get rid of that Euler's number, I do the opposite, and that's the natural log. So again, you just plug it in the calculator. I did the natural log of both sides. So the natural log of 2.56 equals the natural log of E raised to the R2. Again, natural log cancels out the Euler's number, so I can just take those away. So now I have my new equation right here. So it says natural log, natural log of 2.56 equals R2. So again, solve your equation like you would any old equation. You're trying to make those sides the same or even out, balance them out. So I'm trying to get that R by itself. So I divide both sides by 2 because I'm trying to get R on one side by itself. So again, I just plug my numbers into the calculator. I get natural log 2.56 divided by 2 equals R. Again, plug it into the calculator to get that answer, and I get R equals 0.47. Now, I'm going to take that R value and I'm going to convert it into a percentage. So I'm going to multiply that by 100, and I get a growth rate of 4.7. Now, to make sure that you did all your math correctly, you're going to check your work. So just plug in your R value into that original equation, and you should get the correct balanced equation. And in that case, I did, so I know that I was correct. And how does this relate to real life? This is a super cool example that I learned about, and this is from National Geographic, so I encourage you to read it. I have the website listed below, and it's how European rabbits took over Australia. So they were brought over to Australia in the 1800s, and they are super invasive. So now there's an estimated of over 200 million feral rabbits in Australia. And they believe it all started with some wealthy person named Thomas Austin, who received 13 European rabbits to put on his estate in Australia. And he used them for hunting, for sport hunting. And it was estimated that it only took 50 years for those original 13 rabbits to eventually spread all over the continent of Australia. But they're super bad invasive because they destroy crops and land, which increases soil erosions. They overgraze, and they're very adaptable because they have such a high reproductive rate. They can have 4 or more litters a year, and each litter will have between 2 and 5 kits or baby rabbits. And farmers, apparently, they've tried everything. They tried fencing, poisons, even pathogens. And so I found it interesting that in the 1950s, they introduced biocontrol methods. They released a disease into the rabbit population called mycotoxemia, and it's a deadly virus, but unfortunately, a lot of the rabbits developed immunity to it. And so they tried again in 1996, but this time with an even deadlier virus, the rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, and it actually killed up to 90% of the rabbit population, especially in the dry areas. So I found that kind of sad because they introduced that virus to kill all those rabbits, but I understand the ecological standpoint behind it. But it's an interesting read, so please go over to National Geographic and read that article. And then we actually have cases here in the US, feral hog population in Texas. They have no natural predators here. They are an invasive species. They don't belong here. And because people don't really hunt like they used to, their numbers are kind of just growing like crazy. So I also encourage you to read the feral hog population PDF from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. It has a lot of great information on the population growth problems that we have here. And even here at the EEC, we have visits from those feral hogs. And this is some pictures taken a couple of years ago of some feral hogs that were trapped in the Post Oak Preserve across from where we work. And then really quickly, a reflection question for you guys. Why is it important to learn about population birth and growth rates? So what might be the impact of those exponential growth? So I'm going to go ahead and stop our screen share, and we're going to pass it back to Dr. Gorman, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. Very unusual question. You started out your program showing some birth rates of some brown bears. This student wants to know who studied and reported on the birth rate of the brown bears. That would be a job I don't think you'd really want. I wouldn't really want it because they're pretty vicious, I think. But employees of the Journal of Mammalogy, volume 89, are the ones that collected that information or collected information on the birth rate of brown bears. Okay. Mr. Monroe is going to tell us about non-renewable resource depletion. Take it away, Mr. Monroe.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at non-renewable resources depletion. It's a real thing. It's the real deal. And there is an expiration date for some of the non-renewable resources that really we use in our everyday lives. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is share with you a short PowerPoint, and then I'm going to give you some additional information, and then I'm going to issue a challenge to you as students and the future grown-ups that will be inhabiting this world, how you will deal with that problem of energy, furnishing energy for your families, for your everyday lives. So bear with me while I share my screen. Global Citizenship Challenge, renewable and low carbon energy. Of course, that's not what we're really going to be covering, but we are going to be talking about non-renewable resources. This is a question that I'm hoping that you all will be able to answer as we go through part of this PowerPoint. Why do we need alternative forms of energy? Renewable and non-renewable energy sources, and then we'll have a conclusion. Since the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased 38%. This increase of carbon dioxide is understood to be the cause of climate change, which has resulted in a number of environmental issues. Implications of climate change. High temperatures, the planet's average surface temperature has risen by 0.89 degrees Celsius between 1901 and 2012. This rate of increase was not seen before the Industrial Revolution. Changes in rainfall. Data suggests that changes in precipitation, especially in the United Kingdom, winter rainfall is increasing, summer rainfall is decreasing. In North America, heavy rainfall events have become more intensive, and we know that. When we get heavy rains, we're enduring a lot of flooding. Changes in nature. Altered temperatures has led to changes in seasons, causing issues for wildlife. Spring starting earlier in the United Kingdom leads to butterflies appearing earlier and birds changing their migration patterns. And we see the same thing happening here in the North America. Sea ice, melting sea ice does not cause the sea level to rise as it is already on the sea. It does have an effect on the climate. Sea ice helps keep the polar regions cold, and its bright surface reflects 80% of sunlight back into space. If this ice melts, the exposed ocean, instead absorbs 90% of sunlight and can cause a further rise in sea temperature. Now, I'm not going to cover that any further, but I wanted you guys to understand that. These facts come from the United Kingdom, and I will cover the global effect. Non-renewable energy sources. Currently, the United Kingdom burns fossil fuels to meet its energy demands: coal, petroleum, and natural gas. Those are all considered to be fossil fuels and non-renewable resources. Okay, so we're going to skip that. Let's talk about coal. Coal is a non-renewable energy source. And I will tell you this, to be a non-renewable energy source, that means the use of that resource is so fast and so quick that that resource does not have a chance to replenish itself. It's formed by fossilized plants, mined from seams of coal found between rock layers in the earth, burnt to provide heat or electricity. You know what? And it's expected to last for 250 years. Generates pollutants and greenhouse gases. On the other hand, another non-renewable energy resource is oil. It's a carbon-based liquid formed from fossilized animals, pumped out from reservoirs between seams of rock in the earth, widely used in industry and transport. This is expected to last 50 years. Natural gas. Natural gas is another non-renewable energy resource. A hydrocarbon gas primarily containing methane and other gases. It is released through pipes sunk into seams of rock where it is trapped between rock formations, often used for heating, expected to last 70 years. It generates also pollutants and greenhouse gases. And then biomass. It can be a non-renewable or a renewable source generated from decaying plants and animal waste. Chemicals can be used for fuel in diesel engines or organic material being burned for heat and electricity. Can be renewable if crops are replanted, but if they are not replaced, then biomass is a non-renewable energy source. Now, students, listen. When we talk about oil, we're talking about it being a non-renewable resource simply because it's not going to replenish itself anytime soon. Basically, it was formed during the Carboniferous period, 360 to 300 million years ago. Now, as far as coal is concerned, 10 feet of solid vegetation compressed and heated over millions of years creates, believe it or not, 1 foot of coal. And approximately 50% of the United States electricity is generated from coal. Now, I can remember, I'm going to bounce back to oil for a minute. I can remember there was a period of time, it's been a little while ago, that even automobile manufacturers slowed down their manufacturing of large pickup trucks that were considered to be gas guzzlers, and also SUVs that were considered to be gas guzzlers, because there was a fear that we were going to reach our oil producing peak during the oil industry. That is still a concern, okay? Now, as far as natural gas is concerned, natural gas is probably going to be around for 70 years. There are other non-renewable energy resources that scientists are concerned with. for example, there are minerals. Minerals such as copper and zinc that 7 billion people on Earth, they use. There are people that are using that. Even phosphorus. Phosphorus is a very important mineral that is used in helping plants to grow. And they're anticipating or predicting that unless there are new reserves or new places for phosphorus to be found, we're going to run out of that particular very valuable resource somewhere between 50 to 100 years. Now, of course, that's not really during my lifetime. The lifetime that a lot of this is going to be affecting is going to be during your lifetime. So something has to be done to keep those non-renewable resources available, if necessary, for you to use in your everyday lives. Our society is dependent upon non-renewable resources that have, again, an expiration date. And for this reason, it is very important that you all study about non-renewable energy resources and what can be done to protect those non-renewable resources. Now, my challenge to you is I want you to research, is there an effort being done now? And then what efforts can be done in the future? I want you guys to think about that, but more importantly, I want you to think about, is there any effort being put forth today, and how can you help that effort come about in the future? Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and going to go back to Mr. Gorman. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask him and maybe he can answer them for you.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. The question is, what percent of the total energy used annually comes from fossil fuels? And this is worldwide, not just United States. Worldwide, what percent of our energy comes from fossil fuel? And the answer is approximately 80%. So as Mr. Monroe just got through stating, that's going to have to change. Now, Ms. Fuller is going to tell us about the impact on the population.
Hi, boys and girls. We're going to be talking about carrying capacity. So I've got a couple of questions for you to look at while we're going through this segment of our program. What is the most endangered ecosystem in North America? And number two, how can hurricanes help and hurt an ecosystem? So we'll look back at those at the end. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And we're going to talk about impact on populations. So let's talk about the impact on populations due to disease, birth and mortality rates, urbanization, and natural events, carrying capacity, and how it affects ecosystems. So let's start off by talking about, now we've already heard in two sections, Miss Nash and Dr. Gorman gave you a definition of carrying capacity. I'm just going to repeat it because that's what this segment's about. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that an environment can sustain over time without destroying or degrading the environment. So that's going to be it. Now, let's talk about deer. We've got a huge hunting industry here in Texas. It's very important for the ranchers. They make a good deal of their income off hunting, but the hunting has not always been real robust in Texas because of low population amount because of something called a screwworm. Now, the scientists were able to irradiate some pupa and eradicate the screwworm. They released, once the pupa hatched into adults, they released the male insects. They were sterile, and at that time the deer population was low. Now, this worm is devastating. It caused the death of fawns by 80%. on some ranches, as well as mortality on deer. And after the eradication program was completed, the deer population rebounded. In the year after 1960, the deer population increased by three times. This worm, this screw worm, is just horrendous. And what it does is the fly lays its eggs on the perimeter of a wound on an animal, and then it starts laying its eggs on there, and it can kill an animal within a week. It's quite terrible. And you might want to look that up on I didn't include any of the grisly looking wounds, but it's pretty amazing. Now, birth and mortality rates. The populations in an ecosystem are controlled by the balance between death rates and birth rates. And if the death rates decline and the birth rates increase, the population explodes in numbers, outstripping the ability of the ecosystem to support the population. And this in turn can lead to starvation, as was evidenced in the Kaibab in Arizona in the early 1900s. It can cause a collapse of the population. Now, limiting factors can change the dynamics of a population. So let's talk about limiting factors for a second. Limiting factors are things like food availability, water availability, space. All these things can limit populations by lowering birth rates and increasing the death rate, or vice versa, and encouraging migration. Now, let's talk about urbanization. This is a big problem where we live. We live on the Blackland Prairie. The Blackland Prairie is the most endangered ecosystem in North America. And in the map behind me, I don't know if I can show you where my arm is waving over here, this dark swath there, that's the Blackland Prairie. It ranges from up here where we are all the way down to San Antonio in a big curve. And only 1% of it exists in its natural state. All the rest has either been turned over to agriculture or paving the roads, building schools, houses, churches, stores, all that sort of stuff. So urbanization limits population growth in multiple organisms by habitat destruction and by those limiting factors, space, food, and water. And this is a significant factor in the diminishing capacity, carrying capacity on the Blackland Prairie. And some organisms have adapted to living close to us. These are not generally things like antelope and bison, but smaller animals like raccoons. Raccoons and possums and coyotes actually have done very well with urbanization. I think people are surprised when they see a coyote walk down their street, but he's simply adapted to, instead of chasing down rabbits on the prairie, instead of going through your trash can or eating the dog food in your backyard, or if you got a small dog, maybe your dog. Okay, other organisms require a specific amount of space, territory, certain types of trees. One bird that's really suffered is the dickcissel, which is an indigenous bird to Texas, but it grows in a specific type of grass, the bunch grass. And what do we have out on our prairie now is cultivated grasses that are not bunch grasses. So they have had a tremendous decline in numbers. Okay, natural events. Now, hurricanes, polar vortexes, floods, migrations, these are all aspects of the carrying capacity. For migration, the monarch butterflies, they used to come through in the millions, but their numbers have been declining because of the lack of milkweed. That's where they lay their eggs. That is the plant that their larvae feed on. And if they don't have milkweed, it diminishes their numbers. The mortality rate soars. Pests, and also there's a lot of herbicide and pesticide in the upper Midwest that also kills them out. And they've got this tremendous migration from Canada to Mexico and then back to Canada again. Because of that, they're exposed to a lot of these things. Hurricanes, as Hurricane Harvey came through, it did a lot of damage to buildings, but it also flooded all the rivers that flowed into the Gulf of Mexico, churning the nutrients that were in the river bottoms and returning those to the sea, which was really beneficial. But the other problem was floating fresh water, which floated on top of the more dense saline water and caused something of a dead zone. And so they're keeping their eye on specific markers in the Gulf of Mexico as far as this is concerned, like the flower gardens, coral reef. Floods. Alligator gar are actually benefited by floods because that's how they lay their eggs. And the polar vortex, well, it's yet to be determined the damage done to the ecosystem here in Texas by that. But within, I would say, 1 to 5 years, we will probably have a good assessment of how the polar vortex affected the carrying capacity for the organisms here in Texas. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you. And I'm going to show you our questions again. So what's the most endangered ecosystem in North America? The Blackland Prairie, where we live. And how can hurricanes help and hurt an ecosystem? They can help by adding nutrients to the receiving ocean. In our case, it'd be the Gulf of Mexico, but also it can hurt on a lot of different levels with flooding, with the fresh water that floats on top of the saline water. So here's an activity for you to do at home. Talk to a friend or relative about an experience where the natural world taught them a lesson about living a safe and healthy life, and record this in your science notebook for your teacher to see. So I'm going to leave it there with you. I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Gorman. He'll answer any questions you have.
Okay, a very unusual question. Have I had any personal experience about someone trying to control some of the destructive effects or the impact on population, anything with impact on population? And Miss Fuller covered the screw worm. And many, many years ago, I used to deer hunt down on at the conjunction of the Pecos and the Rio Grande River, way down South Texas. And there was 17,000 acre ranch. And I think I walked over the whole thing because I hunted there for 10 years. But I kept noticing these little white packages that look very similar to the container. If you go to a Chinese restaurant and buy the food to take out food, you get the little white cardboard containers. And these little containers look very similar to that. And I was totally confused. First off, there was no Chinese restaurant within 300 miles of where I was. And I couldn't believe those ranchers were driving around eating Chinese food and throwing the little containers out. So after a couple of days of seeing them, I asked the rancher what was the deal, what was going on. And that was how they were distributing the male sterilized flies. They would sterilize those flies, they put them in little containers, and they take an airplane and fly over and throw them out, and it would break open and the male sterilized flies would get out. And that was what was going on. And I was kind of dumb because I had no idea. I thought somebody was eating Chinese food down on the South Texas border. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students related carrying capacity to population dynamics, calculated birth rates, and exponential growth of populations, analyzed and predicted the effects of non-renewable resource depletion, and analyzed and made predictions about the impact on populations of geographic locales due to diseases, birth and death rates, urbanization, and natural events. Ms. Nash covered carrying capacity, birth rates, and exponential growth was by Ms. Ramirez, Mr. Monroe, non-renewable resource depletion, and Ms. Fuller, impact on population. We'd like for you to tell us how we did. Teachers, if you would, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and fill out a short form. We would appreciate that because that kind of lets us know what, if we're on the right track. Thank you for joining us today. You guys have a great rest of the day, but more importantly, you have a great rest of your life.